Great. I guess good evening, everyone. Thank you guys for coming to this talk on the serverless security. My name is Yan Cui. I'm a principal engineer at a company called The Zone, which you may not have heard of. We are a subscription-based platform where you can watch sports both live as well as on demand. And oops, should have done that. For all intents and purposes, you can think of us as Netflix, but for sports instead. We've got offices in quite a few locations now, in London, in Hammersmith, in Leeds, Katowice, in Poland, as well as in Tokyo. I'm telling you all this because, of course, we're hiring people. We've got some really interesting technical challenges. Imagine how many people that want to log in and watch Real Madrid play Barcelona in the El Clasico. So we have some really interesting technical challenges to meet those kind of massive spiky load when it comes to watching live sports. So on a more personal note, I've been using AWS for quite a while now. First, when I was working at a gaming company back in 2009. And before I started The Zone, I worked at a company called Yubble, which is a social network that you can think of as a mix of Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And it was there that I worked on a serverless architecture that is both event-driven as well as service-oriented, where Lambda is the centerpiece that glues all these things together. I did a whole talk on some of the things we learned in terms of how do you do operations for serverless in the production. But for today, I want to focus more on the security aspect of working with serverless. For starters, what happens with the shared responsibility model that everyone's familiar with that when you work with AWS? Well, the infrastructure piece is now taken care of by Amazon, which is great. They are now responsible for patching and updating the OS, making sure that you have the latest security updates, and so on. And that's great news for us because for most of us application developers, it's just not our primary concern that we don't want to take time off from writing business logic and shipping features to now I need to update my AMI to make sure that I've got the latest security patch and so on. So having Amazon taking over this responsibility means that we are better protected against attacks against the operating system, attacks such as WannaCry. And more recently, we probably all remember what happened with the Meltdown and the Spectre. In fact, if you were running your workload on serverless with, say, AWS Lambda, you would be patched for Meltdown and Spectre without you having done anything. In fact, there was a whole thread happened while that happened that Amazon announced that, all of our EC instances that are running Lambda has been patched for Meltdown and Spectre. And then at that point, we all realized, we've completely forgot about it because we didn't have to do anything to patch our servers because, again, those servers are no longer our responsibility. What is still our responsibility is our code. We still have to fix vulnerabilities that we have in our own code, as well as any third-party dependencies that we have. And when you look at the OWASP Top 10, which is a list of top 10 security risks to web applications, most of the things are still there since 2013. In fact, when you compare against the list from 2010, you see pretty much most of the things are still there as well. Embarrassingly, injection attack and broken authentication is still very much top of the list for about 10 years running. So clearly, we're making the life of all of these analysts a bit too easy. We just constantly suffer from the same security breaches. And when the guys from Snike, Guy Pojani, he did an analysis on the biggest security breaches that happened in 2016, he found that something like 24% of the top 50 data breaches happened in 2016 happened because the applications were using components with known vulnerabilities. So this is where you're depending on some third-party library that's got a known vulnerability, but you haven't updated to the latest version where that has been fixed. They also found that of the 5,000 top URLs from Alexa, 77% of them was using at least one JavaScript library that has some known vulnerabilities. And which is probably not surprising when you consider that even some of the biggest libraries you'll find out there, so the likes of React and jQuery and Handlebars, at some point in time, they all had some vulnerabilities in previous version that had then been fixed subsequently. But it's still your responsibility to make sure that you patch your code to the latest version where those vulnerabilities has been fixed. And if you're using the user agent library, which is actually very popular by looking at the number of downloads it sees per month, At one point, it had a vulnerability for regex denial of service attack. So this, if you got a regex query and someone can call your site with a user agent that's very long, that almost matches your pattern, but not quite, so that it takes more and more and more time for you to pass the user agent. And of course, there's the dreaded SQL injection attacks. You've probably all seen this SKCD at some point in your career. Even if you put all your application logic into serverless functions where you don't have to worry about running servers anymore, ultimately your application are still vulnerable to these type of attacks when you are not sanitizing the user input that you receive. And even when you're using NoSQL databases such as MongoDB, you're not entirely safe from those attacks either. It's entirely possible to do injection attacks against MongoDB. You may argue, therefore, services like Amazon's DynamoDB, because of the way the API works, it's a lot harder to do injection attacks, at least not one that I've heard about. But ultimately, you are still vulnerable to other forms of exploits, such as cross-site scripting, for example. The takeaway here is that even as you move the execution environment for your code, you still have to make sure that you do the due diligence to sanitize the input for your function, but equally as important to sanitize the output from your function. What we often see in the serverless space is that for one particular workflow, one function will receive some input to some processing, and then it will pass output to the next function in the chain. And that's where Amazon has got services such as step function to orchestrate that kind of workflow very easily for you. But that means if you have a security, where you have problems, you can actually pass those problems on as through the output of one function to the next, which is why you should also think about how you should sanitize those outputs. And equally, if you are just fetching data from the database and just returning out as JSON without sanitizing and checking your output, it's quite easy for you to accidentally return information that you maybe not intended to do in the first place. So, for example, even if you are not sanitizing input, so you grab some additional data that you shouldn't do, and you just return the data as it is, then of course now you started to leak your customer's data potentially. And GraphQL, you probably have heard about this as well. It's been picking up in popularity, even much more so than serverless in the last couple of years. And ultimately, GraphQL also allows you to talk to some endpoint somewhere and manipulate data. So anything that allows you to manipulate data somehow means that you can probably manipulate that communication to make it do things that it's not intended for. So it's possible for you to still do injection attack even against GraphQL. Takes a bit more work, increasingly more work, but still it's totally doable. And in terms of injection attacks, you can also suffer from code injection attack. In fact, if you were one of the few, well, I guess one of the unlucky people that were using this Dust.js library that's maintained by none other than LinkedIn, they had a vulnerability whereby they allowed callers to inject code or to execute code in your JavaScript or your Node.js application. The takeaway here, I guess, is that your application dependencies is a very large attack surface, probably much larger than you realize. And it's a problem that's compounded even further by the fact that many of the dependencies have got their own dependencies as well. And if you look at request, which is a very popular HTTP library, a client library in Node.js, you can see that's actually that doesn't have that many direct dependencies, but each of these dependencies also then have other dependencies. And this is not just limited to Node.js either. I'm sure you can poke at any number of popular Java or Scala libraries to find a huge list of dependencies that are transient to that particular dependency. And of course, being NPM and Node.js, you can find loads of memes around the internet just about how bad these transient dependencies can be. So trying to make sure that you patch not just your direct dependencies, but all of your transient dependencies as well is a huge task. It's something that is very hard for us to do because we are always busy writing code and delivering features, which is why services such as Snike is really useful, whereby it continuously scans your application for dependence against your application's dependencies to look for known vulnerabilities, and in some cases can also apply patches for you directly. And Snike has got built-in integration with Lambda. And recently, I also noticed that GitHub started doing that as well. I get a weekly report from GitHub telling me which of my repos has got dependencies that has got known vulnerabilities, and that I should go and fix it. the tricky thing I find with patching your dependencies is that unlike those patches you find with your OS, they're always self-contained. It's trusted because it comes from Microsoft or from Oracle or someone, and they're easy to apply. With a lot of these libraries, when there is a patch for some security vulnerability, oftentimes they get released as a new version or with other changes that you may not want, or in some cases, you may be at the end of the version 1.10, and there's a vulnerability there that is fixed in version 2. And because that's a major version update, that means now you have quite a bit of work to update your application to work with whatever broken API changes that you have with that version as well. And it's safe to say that your security is only as strong as the weakest link. And for serverless application, you've got the application itself that's got dependencies, that has got authors for those dependencies, and your application itself has got users and developers and so on. And of course, you are probably going to be running all of your code inside Amazon's ecosystem. And if we're talking about movie, of course, the attacker is going to target the physical infrastructure that Amazon runs with armed guards walking around the premises so that they can pull off stunts like, what you see in the Mission Impossible. Or in some cases, you go in there, kick some ass, blow some stuff up, and then you walk away like a boss. But in the real world, no one in their right mind is going to try to target Amazon's physical infrastructure because there's so many low-hanging fruits. You can do all kinds of attacks, as we saw with the overall top 10 list, against the application layer. You can also target the dependencies for your applications as well. And oftentimes, you find that the people around your software are the weakest link in the whole thing. And anyone who's watched Mr. Robot, which is an excellent show, if you haven't watched it, definitely recommend it. You see a lot of the characters, oftentimes when they try to hack into a system, they don't just open up a laptop and write some grab and then magically get into the system somehow, but instead they will do social engineering and they target the users of those systems or they target the developers of those systems through phishing. And in fact, I think in one of the episodes, the main character's sister just goes to the police station, threw a few USB keys on the floor, and when the policeman picked it up, plugged it into the laptop, and they installed the worm, and that's how they go into the system. And of course, you can attack the developers for your application as well by, say, brute forcing against the GitHub account or using known password leaks that's been leaked elsewhere to try to get into the source code of your system. And once they have done that, then they can do all kind of, they know how your code works, so it makes it easier for them to understand where your vulnerabilities are. But turns out there's another group of people that you can attack maybe even easier, and those are the authors for the packages that you depend on. And this happened last year, I think in July, whereby a security researcher managed to gain published access to 14% of all NPM packages. And that list includes, I guess, the stars like React and Request, Debug, Cheerio, Redux, and Mongoose, and so on. So these packages are used by I don't know how many, hundreds of thousands of developers worldwide, and account for something like 20% of total monthly downloads from NPM. So take a moment to think about how the kind of numbers we're talking about here. So that's what 1,000. That's 1.9 million or 1.9 billion downloads, which is a lot of, ultimately it's a lot of downloads from NPM, all of which could have contained some malicious code that the security, whoever the attacker would have injected into those packages without you knowing. The most upsetting thing for me about the whole thing is that the security researcher who found these problems didn't do anything particularly crazy. It was a simple case of combining brute force attack with known account leaks from other sources. So if a developer's credentials have been leaked elsewhere, passwords been leaked elsewhere, through one of many breaches we've seen over the years, with a combination of brute force, so that you based on the known password that's been leaked, and you modify it gradually to see whether or not you can find his new password. And in some cases, you also find that some developers' NPM credentials has been leaked on GitHub account, GitHub repos, public GitHub repos, so it's just right there for the picking. And then you have about 1,000 or so developers whose accounts were protected by a password such as 123, which which is just really, really upsetting. I'm building applications that's going to support millions of users, so all those users' informations I have to be careful with those users' information, and yet all of a sudden my dependencies, or the authors of my dependencies, is potentially leaking access to my applications through I don't know, through this, I don't know, what's the best way to describe someone who just doesn't care? I don't know the word for it now, but imagine in your application, in fact, anything that runs in EC2 or on Lambda would have a number of environment variables that allows the incidents to authenticate against the AWS services. So inside your Lambda's execution environment, for example, you're going to find environment variables for AWS credential, AWS as key, access ID, as well as secret token. Basically, all the information someone would need to be able to authenticate and access Amazon resources using from your account. So to show you how easily this could be done, in fact, it took me about half an hour to put together as a demo, and whereby I have a malicious package where I would download your environment variables and I send it to some service that I'm running somewhere. And even though I called it to not download this package, in the first week there was about 200 downloads, which is mind-boggling how that can happen. Fortunately, I had a foresight to know that someone's going to download this when they shouldn't, so I had a switch in the code so that only when a particular environment variable is present would I then try to collect your environment variables and send it to my evil service. So if you look at what I did, imagine I had managed to get published access to one of, I don't know, a React or something, and right before the module exports, I can add a bit of code that just inspects your environment variables and send it wholesome to some backend service I've got running, which of course is going to be running in Lambda because serverless. And I'm going to check your environment variables. If you got anything that's called AWS Access Key ID, secret key, and session token, then I publish a message to SNS, and I hook up my email so that whenever someone downloads my package and runs their code the first time, I'm going to get a nice email that I can just copy and then put into a terminal. And as you can see, I was able to do that and use the credentials I got from my Lambda function to run commands against to list my S3 bucket contents. And that was just way too easy. And it doesn't have to be your direct dependencies either. Even if it's an indirect dependency. So suppose this is another package that I have got published, which again, there's people are downloading it. I don't know why. So this guy doesn't do anything malicious. Instead, all he's doing is he's got a dependency on the other malicious package that I published. I was still able to do this just as easily as before. Seriously, it really saddens me how easy it is. And you may think, sure, but that's just the demo you put together. This is never going to happen in real life, right? Turns out you didn't even have to hijack some other package. You can just publish another package with a very similar name, but do the same thing, and people will take a bait. So this happened recently. Recently, I said, because last year, whereby a hacker who's not even subtle about what he's trying to do, published a bunch of packages whose name sounds very similar to legitimate packages. Only difference being, he's stealing your environment variables and sending it somewhere else, and probably to mine the bitcoins, as is the flavor of the day. And another thing with NPM, it turns out you can easily do is when you install NPM package, you can run some script, including to just I have no words for what this would do. And by default, this NPM in NPM that this character that basically means that when you do NPM install, don't just download that particular version. Download the most recent version that's compatible with 1.0. So until someone goes to 2.0, I can just get I think this case is 1.1, 1.2, and so on. Which means even if the version that I install initially is legit, is safe, if that package got somehow hijacked and the attacker published a malicious version with a patched version update, by the time my code builds and gets packaged up on my CI box, I'm going to get the compromised version instead, completely unknown to me. And then by the time my code gets shipped to Lambda or to a container and running, it's going to be running a compromised version that's probably leaking my credentials to somewhere else. So tip for this one, I guess the takeaway here is that you should use npm string wrap, or in this case, if you update to the latest versions of npm, it does that for you already. So essentially, all that's doing is locking your dependency to the specific version that you install initially. There's also other things you can do to make sure that you check against the hash for the package and so on. But just imagine if this wasn't a security researchers that found this problem, but it was actually a malicious attacker, which could have happened already. We maybe just don't know. They could have infected 20% of monthly downloads from NPM with some malicious code and collect AWS credentials at a massive scale. And this is not a problem that's specific to NPM either. I know I'm picking on NPM because I've been working with Node.js for a while, and some of the things I see there, it's crazy. But I've worked with .NET for many years. I've worked with Java and Scala, and you find similar problems in pretty much every single place, like every single runtime and every single community you find. So once your first line of defense has been breached, now the attackers are in. The next line of defense is making sure that your identity and access management stops the attacker from being able to do more than to inflict massive damage on your environment. So this is where the questions such as who can invoke your function and what can the functions actually access becomes really important. And this is where the principle of least privilege is your best friend. And this also applies to VPCs as well. One of the things that I often see is when people have got stuff running inside EC2 or with containers, you do a lot of work to harden the security around the boundaries of a VPC. You put the public-facing stuff inside a public VPC, but all the internal services are running inside some private VPC that's not publicly accessible, and then use VPC peering so that the public-facing stuff can still talk to the internal services. And you've got all the security checks and stuff like that in front of the public VPC. But everything that's in here, anything that's inside the public VPC is trusted. You are part of our services, so you can access anything that we have in the internal APIs. There's no authentication in any of these services that we have in our private VPC. Now, when you talk about serverless, and when you want to build an HTTP endpoint API with API Gateway and Lambda, API Gateway not by default is always public. There is no way for you to say create an API that's only accessible from a private VPC somewhere. Instead, what you have to do is implement authentication. So for public-facing APIs, you should consider using API keys or Cognito, or maybe writing your own custom authorizer function for the authentications as well. And then the problem with this approach is that once a server becomes compromised through somehow, it could be code injection, it could be compromised dependencies, now means the attacker, as long as that server is available, has a way to get into your system. This becomes like a backdoor to the rest of your system. So now the attacker can start poking around things, can start talking to internal APIs that you don't want them to. Which is why it's important for you to also implement authentication for the internal APIs you have in the private VPCs. And when again talking about serverless with Lambda, with internal APIs that you create with API Gateway and Lambda, what you should do is leverage the fact that you can actually have IAM roles, IAM policies with API Gateway, so that one's ability to interact with that API is determined by the IAM credentials that they have received. So coming from your public-facing APIs and talking to internal APIs, those functions, so the public-facing functions would have IAM role, each one of them, and based on that role, it determines whether or not that function can talk to your internal APIs. And to use AWS IAM role authorization is actually really simple. If you're using the serverless framework to do all of your serverless applications, then it's literally one line of code that you need to add to an endpoint to enable that. The other thing is you need to minimize what your function can actually access. And this is where you having For APIs, as far as APIs are concerned, making sure that every endpoint is using one function rather than one function for all of the different endpoints and do the routing yourself, because it means that you now have ability to finally control what each of those endpoints can do by giving every single function a dedicated IAM role. So suppose I've got an endpoint that's going to that can create user, delete user, and return user details, for example. Each of those endpoints will have different assets depending on what it is that you're doing. So you can give those individual functions the right permission that limits it to exactly and only what it needs to access. And thankfully, for the serverless framework at least, there's a plugin that you can find that allows me to then, in the definition for one function, give it just the IAM permissions that function would need. So in this case, I've got multiple functions. So one of them needs to read something from a particular folder, from S3, and also write an object to another different S3 folder. None of the other functions in the same project would need those assets, so that I can tailor the permission for individual functions very finely. Of course, this takes a bit more work and does require a bit of a developer education as well, discipline, to make sure that it actually works. And then the problem with the IAM and the Lambda is that when you release a new version of a Lambda function, the IAM permissions are not versioned along with that function. So where you are introducing new features, for example, that requires new permissions, by adding those permissions to that and deploy your Lambda function with a new version of your code, you also give older version of your code additional assets that they don't need as well, which is a problem. And similarly, if you were to remove some permissions from a new version, that's going to impact previous versions of your code as well. And this was a much bigger problem in serverless version 0.5 and below, because because this framework, when you do a deployment, was reusing the same API gateway configuration, but using stages instead for the different environments. But since they went to 1.x, thankfully the framework guys listened to the feedback from the community. So now, whenever you do a deployment, you don't use aliases by default. Instead, every environment is a new version, or is a new Lambda function. So you have the names of your function reflect the fact that it's got the name of the service, followed by the name of the environment, then followed by the name of the actual function. So that this way, it allows you to introduce those kind of changes to permissions when you go from one version to another, because you never actually have the same multiple versions of the same function running at any moment in time. Another thing that you find that in the AWS Lambda's documentation is that you should write your function in a sort of stateless way, which is, of course, because your Lambda functions are ephemeral. You don't control the life cycle of that function. It can get garbage collected without you knowing. So making sure that your state is safe elsewhere makes perfect sense in this world. But it does mean that now you have more and more data stored in other services that you need to secure both at rest as well as in flight. Thankfully, many of the AWS services offers server-side encryption out of the box. For example, you can enable server-side encryption with S3, and some database types with RDS, as well as with Kinesis streams nowadays as well. And again, now you make sure that you are encrypting data at rest, and you also combine that with controlling who can, while minimizing who can actually access those data. Another thing you also often hear from the AWS team is that whenever a function is no longer necessary, no longer used, you should delete it straight away, because old functions that are hanging around, they remain as an attack surface for attackers to exploit, and for something that's no longer being actively maintained, they are even more likely to have known vulnerabilities as those vulnerabilities are discovered, because no one is actively working on those functions. So they're going to be running with whatever old version of the dependencies it was created with in the first place. And when new vulnerabilities are discovered, then those attack surfaces become more and more, I guess, lucrative for attackers. However, I find this is a lot easier said than done, especially in a large company whereby ownership for individual components is quite hard to pin down, especially as people move around different teams or as they come and leave the company. And when you consider that instead of it's quite hard to find out who owns the service X that we don't seem to be using anymore, but we're not really sure. Now, instead of having services, you have even more granularity, individual functions. How do you find out who owns that function, whether or not that function is not being used because it's no longer needed, or is it because it's only used for, say, disaster recovery scenarios, and the fact that it's not being used only reflects the fact that you're lucky that you haven't had a disaster scenario yet. So even though you hear often people talk about you should delete things when they're no longer necessary, but given the reality we face, I often find that that's a lot harder to do than in practice. So if anyone has got any ideas on how to do that better, please come talk to me afterwards. It's one of the things I keep having to fight about. Another thing to consider is denial of service attacks. And with Lambda, you can scale beautifully and very, very quickly, much faster than you can scale with EC2 and in many cases with your own containers as well. So chances are you can probably even brute force your way through a denial of service attack. However, you do pay for Lambda for invocation as well as other resources that you use, including API Gateway, for example, which is a lot more expensive than Lambda themselves, as well as all the logs that gets pumped into CloudWatch logs, which is also another source of cost for your infrastructure. So the denial of service attacks becomes the new denial of wallet attacks in the serverless world, whereby even though you could scale your way through this attack, you're going to end up paying a lot of money for it instead. You might say, sure, then you just enable concurrency limiting and throttling so that you don't ever spend more than you actually, you don't ever say have more concurrent executions at API gateway level than you want to, but then you end up having to have a denial of service a problem whereby someone can take your system down by injecting it with lots of throughput. So in this space, you also have AWS Shield. If you pay a premium, I think something like $3,000 per month, it also gives you access to AWS Shield Advanced as well, which has interestingly allows you access to a specialized team in AWS whenever you're under attack. But also it has some so during an attack, any cost that you experience that you incur through in the ELB, in the CloudFront and Route 53, you can get those money back. But as far as I know, there's no plans to include Lambda costs in this with AWS Shield Advanced as well. Another thing to consider with Lambda is that when you're talking about async invocations such as SNS messages or CloudWatch events or S3 and so on, the default is that if for function errors, you get 2 retries out of the box, and then there's a delete queue support as well, which is great for building stuff that are resilient without having to do all the retry yourself. And the opportunity guys did some research and found that the number of retries can actually go up past the documented 2 retries. So what happens if you are under a denial of service attack and the attacker found a way to trigger async invocations that causes your function to error? Now the automated retry kicks in, so they can start to magnify the impact of that denial of service attack. And suppose your function has got a long timeout, and somehow they manage to combine those denial of service attack with a regex denial of service attack, and with your long timeout, your function is going to be running for a lot longer as well. So the costs start to compound more and more, and it can really leave a dent in your AWS budget. How are we doing on time? All right. So on a more positive note, when you have servers, you have to manage them over time. The server is going to get infested with viruses and compromises and so on. And when you don't have servers, it also means that you don't have to worry about those compromised servers that lives on for a very long time in your environment, acting as a backdoor for any attackers. But your Lambda functions ultimately is still running on some server somewhere, and the containers are being reused for efficiency reasons. And it's possible for you to put data into a temp folder so that you've got any information, you can store them temporarily, and those data will persist for as long as the container is still available and being reused. But what you should avoid is putting any sort of sensitive data, including anything that identifies your customers, inside that temp folder, because again, if your function is compromised, anything that's inside that temp folder is now up for grabs for the attacker. And before Lambda, before all these other things that happened, we were developing web applications using all these wonderful web frameworks. And one of the things you get with many of these web frameworks is the ability to allow to enable directory listing. And in some of the frameworks, I think it's enabled by default as well, that you have to remember to disable it. And if you do a quick Google search, you will find many companies are accidentally leaking their application config or the SQL connection strings, or in some cases, even their entire SQL Server dump, just publicly available right there on the internet for anyone who cares to look for it, which is probably why in the 2017 overall top 10 list, the sensitive data exposures jumped a few places all the way to number 3. With serverless, you get away with all these servers, but at the same time, you also get away with all these web frameworks. You don't need them to develop web applications anymore. And one of the sort of benefits from that is, besides simplicity, is that now if you want something like directory listing, it's actually a feature that you have to implement yourself, which means that you have to make a very conscious decision on when you actually want to have a directory listing, which is hopefully never. And you can't really talk about security these days without talking about Bitcoins, because this is a very good reason for attackers to want to attack your system and steal your credentials. And if you just have a quick look on the internet, you'll find many stories about how developers accidentally leave their AWS credentials on a public GitHub repo somewhere, sometimes even just for a few minutes, and then they wake up to a massive AWS bill. In fact, just inside my social circle, I know of 2 companies who has had more than $100,000 worth of AWS bill at the end of a month because one of the employees was accidentally leaked their credentials, and those credentials were being used by attackers to mine Bitcoins. And when I was researching this problem, one of the ways that you can easily, mitigate the problem is by using Git commit hooks, so that before anything gets committed to GitHub, you do some sanity check to look for patterns that matches your AWS credentials, and when you do find them, make sure that you stop the commit right away. Another thing you can do at the runtime is make sure that you monitor any activities in the regions that you're not using. From what I hear from my AWS contacts, Sao Paulo and Tokyo are the hotbeds for attackers who mine Bitcoins when they have stolen your credentials, because those are areas that not many of the AWS customers are actually doing workloads in. So if you're seeing that you've got some EC2 activities in those regions that you're not using, then make sure that you alert yourself. You can do that using a combination of CloudTrail as well as the CloudWatch events. And when you have a multi-account environment, you can also do this relatively easily nowadays using because now you can send CloudWatch events across multiple accounts, but in the same region. Also, set up billing alarms if you've got regions that you're not using, so there shouldn't be any activities at all. So when you do get those activities and you start to seeing AWS bill coming in, then make sure that you alert yourself and stop it straight right away. I think one of the last thing I want to talk about is the concept of bulkheads, which is initially a pattern that's used by ship makers to compartmentalize any hull breach or otherwise leaks. And it's a pattern that's been popularized in the microservices space by, of course, none other than Michael Nygaard in his released book, and is baked into the Hystrix library by Netflix. And there's several other bulkheads that you can build into your serverless application to compartmentalize any security breaches as well. We talked about the least privilege principle and making sure that you can compartmentalize the breaches at the function level by making sure every function is only given the permission that it absolutely needs to perform the business logic that it needs to do. And also make sure that you have account level isolation so that if your dev account is compromised, at least the attackers won't be able to use those credentials to gain access to your real production data. So just a quick recap on what we talked about today. That your application dependencies is probably a much bigger attack surface than you realize. And even as you go into the world of serverless, all walls will be still as relevant as before. You should definitely sanitize the inputs to your functions as well as the output from your functions as well. And the principle of least privilege is your best friend, and make sure that every function is given just enough permission to do what it needs to do and nothing more and nothing less. You have lots of data stored in other places, and make sure that those data are all secured at rest as well as in flight. And if you know for a fact that a function is no longer necessary, then proactively delete them when you can. Denial of service is a new denial of wallet attack in the serverless world. You get some protection from AWS Shield Advanced, but they don't cover the cost for Lambda when you do during an attack. So the eventual destiny for any server is to become virus infested. So no server means you don't have to worry about having long-lived servers that are compromised and act as a backdoor for any attackers. And make sure that you don't become a Bitcoin miner for criminals by safeguarding your credentials using Git pre-commit hooks so that you prevent accidental leaks of your credentials onto public GitHub repos. And compartmentalize any security breaches using account-level isolation. And remember that, as is often the case, people are the weakest link in any sort of security scenario. And thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, I think we've got about 10 minutes. Any questions? Okay, if you have no questions, then they can go. So just get in touch with me. I'm probably going to be in the hole for a little bit, and you also get in touch with me online as well. Again, thank you guys very much.